We have the HDR. Is there a mic? No, okay, we're okay. All right, we can start 1 minute early. It's Friday. We unmuted at the Zoom? Okay, good. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space, and thank you for joining us for today's event, a panel on interdisciplinary research, part of Milieux Institute's week-long residency and exhibition here, operating under the title The Commons. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, and we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And at fourth space, we work with university community, try to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities and events that examine research questions and projects across the university. And I might add, with a specific focus on supporting interdisciplinary work. We are running this hybrid event as a Zoom meeting as well. So we welcome any comments and questions with a raised hand or via the chat there. And of course, for you in the space here, and if you'd like to participate, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you for the question period. But with that, it is very much my pleasure to hand it over to Milieu Head of Operations and Coordination, Harry Smoke. Harry.
Thank you, Doug. Good morning, everybody. So I'm just going to make a few remarks now to introduce everybody and give everyone an overview of the schedule. We have about 2 hours, and we've left a lot of time for discussion. So I'm really looking forward to questions, and please feel free to be thinking as we go along about the kind of questions you want to ask. I'll just briefly introduce our discussion panelists, and I'll let them say a little about themselves when they're presenting their projects. We're looking at 3 case studies of interdisciplinary research at Milieu, and not just Milieu, but with partner institutions here in Montreal and elsewhere. So just briefly, I'll introduce Alice Jarry and her collaborator, Marta Cerruti, from McGill Biointerface Lab, and Alice Jarry is also one of our associate directors here at Milieu and is a director of the Biolab. Some of you may have saw their team who's presenting yesterday. It was a very lively discussion. Jody Allen next, one of our PhD candidates here at Milieu. Bart Simon, who will also say a little more about Milieu after I've finished, who is a director of Milieu, is a sociologist. Jody and Bart are going to be talking about their project. Stefanie Duguay and postdoc Christopher Dietzel, who I just met this morning. This is very exciting. Christopher is coming in new as a postdoc to Milieu and is working with Steph, and they're going to be presenting their project on dating apps and the influence of COVID and the rest. So, okay, I won't say anything more at this time. I'm going to hand it over to Bart, who I believe wanted to say a little bit about Milieu and just the general ethos.
I did. I will. Good morning, everybody. So I won't say much because we want to get to the case studies, but I thought I would drop some concepts that we can pick up a little bit later in the discussion, because Milieu as an institute was designed, I guess, around this premise of interdisciplinary collaboration. And that word is dangerous, troublesome word, goes back a long way in academia. I remember even as an undergraduate student in an interdisciplinary program of cultural studies, how much we were talking about being interdisciplinary at that time, back in the 80s. And programs are starting all over the place. All the studies programs and things like that all appeared late 70s, early 80s. Many of them have died since. So there's a long trajectory in terms of making academia more interdisciplinary or providing opportunities for interdisciplinary exploration, both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences, humanities, and in the arts. Milieu was built to try to create opportunities for interdisciplinary engagement. And right off the bat, we tried to distinguish, and this is important as a help for setting the context of the discussion here, between something I call practical interdisciplinarity and paper interdisciplinarity. So paper interdisciplinarity is the love of interdisciplinarity, the sort of let's be interdisciplinary. let's get together and solve the world's problems. And you can't solve the world's problems from one single disciplinary perspective. So let's all gather around the table and share our thing. So that sells, it's really big. You see it everywhere. And it's important. It's not important, but it's very different than the practical work of doing interdisciplinarity. And so we wanted to design infrastructure and culture for the practical work of doing interdisciplinarity. And that's kind of the setup for the kind of projects we're talking about here. So there's distinction between sort of how nice it is to be interdisciplinary and like, what is the work of it? And how might these things be different? So for Milieu, it's an organizational problem. How do we set up the conditions under which interdisciplinary practice is not only possible, but desirable in an academic setting, which doesn't really privilege it? What's privileged are the disciplines and the programs that are related to the disciplines. So we're living in an environment where it's tough to do interdisciplinary work from an organizational perspective. So how do we make it more possible, but also more desirable? So with that in mind, I can, I guess, leave it to like the case studies. And then I hope in the conversation, we can come back to some of these themes and we can talk both at the organizational level and at the practical sort of bench level about how this stuff gets going. Does that make sense? Good, good. Now what do we do? Oh, back to you, Harry.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for each pair, I guess, to present their project. I don't know who would like to start. Alice and Marta, you want to take it? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I don't know where the feedback is. It is. Oh, now it works. Okay, sorry about that. We think we're all used to Zoom, but not so much. Okay. So I'm Alice Jarry, prof in design and computation arts, also associate director of McGill.
And I'm Marta Cerruti, professor in materials engineering at McGill University. Yeah, so Alice and I met in Concordia a few years ago, thanks to a visit that was co-organized by Jim Liesel, who's there, who was the Dean of Engineering at the time and the Dean of Fine Arts at the time. And we noticed right away that our research had some common threads. So we both work at the interface between bio and synthetic kind of materials. So in my lab is called the Biointerface Lab. So we work a lot on materials that are meant to go in people's body. So implants and also scaffolds, materials where cells can grow. So you can see on the picture a scaffold made of graphene oxide where cells are happily growing and penetrating inside.
And yes, the Biolab, we also work across scaffolds, membranes, surfaces, porous materials. We work across wet and electronic media and look at how the technosphere impacts the changing status of life on the planet. And the work you see here is a bioplastic membrane that was presented at the Pompidou Center in 2021 and developed in the Biolab by the team.
So you saw in the title, the work that we present today is about graphene oxide. So I'll start with a little introduction on what graphene oxide is. It's a nanomaterial, very light and very strong, and it has a structure that's very similar to graphite, same material that you have in your pencil leads. So graphite leaves a little trace on the paper because there are these layers of carbon atoms that sheds when you write. And each one of these layers is called graphene. And if you take graphite and you put it in acid and kind of shake it, these flakes, these sheets can separate and become graphene oxide. So kind of like the graphene, but with some oxygenated functionalities that make the graphene oxide material have some interesting properties. So one is that it's biodegradable. So you put it in biological environment and it degrades into molecules like what you see on the screen, which are very similar to humic acid. So the same acid that's present in dirt. And the other interesting property is that thanks to these oxygen functionalities, it becomes possible to make suspensions in water out of this graphene oxide. So then when you take the suspensions, you filter them and you dry them, you get membranes. If you look at them in a microscope, in an electron microscope, you can see these membranes are made by nanoscopic layers that are the arrangements of these nanosheets. And they are a few microns thick, so about 1/100th of the diameter of a hair. That's the thickness of the whole stack. And an easy possible application for these membranes, because they have this layer structure, is as filters. So some molecules go through, others don't. So you can imagine they can become filters for air or for water.
And speaking about filters, Marta and I started working together in 2021. I received an award, the Petro-Canada Young Innovator Award, and I decided to put my Petro points on sustainability. And so basically I approached Marta, whom I met previously, and we decided to work together on the question of air filtration and see how graphene oxide could improve the filtering properties of certain biomaterials. So we worked with abaca leaves, which is a species of banana indigenous to the Philippines, and developed different filters. And this brought us to new questions of research and see the potential of graphene oxide for different applications, both in the arts and science. So we got interested into how graphene oxide can not only demonstrate plastic functionalities or malleability, but also how it could react to its environment, how it could react to different stimulation, and how our engagement with this material could also transform the engagement between artists, scientists, and publics.
So because we wanted to make these structures become reactive, we looked into nature. Of course, in nature, everything is reactive. So you have plants that grow towards light and turn towards light, and you have skin whose pores open and close depending on temperature and humidity. So we wanted to try to make these materials that kind of mimicked natural materials and became responsive to similar stimuli. And so we wrote a project for FRQ. So Audace, it was a program that really wanted interdisciplinary beyond natural science and social science and humanities collaborations. And the project was on creating these structures out of graphene oxide, bidimensional, three-dimensional, that would be responsive. So the idea was to go from the nanoscale, stuff that we can do in my lab, to the macro scale with the help of Alice's lab. And at the same time, while doing this project, to develop new methods for collaboration between artists and scientists.
And for us, it was, well, I think maybe now it's clear that we both have interest in developing new sustainable materials. So this project was also really a way of finding means to reflect on material futures and our ways of engaging with materials. So basically, the field of responsive architecture, soft robotics, active materials is established. We use different forms of sensors, actuators, integrated malleable materials and membranes, but we really push the technicalities and aesthetic possibilities of graphene oxide, and it's a newcomer in the field of active materials. It's the first time that it's responsiveness to humidity, to heat, and to light is used in that field.
So here are the two teams. The idea was really to have people from engineering work with people from fine arts in a collaborative, iterative approach. So you can see on the left, students and postdocs from my lab, and on the right, students from Alice lab, and also Jacob Landry, a filmmaker student. And so we would go from one lab to the other kind of in alternate weeks and develop these materials, like I said before, from the nano to the macro scale. And at the same time, Jacob would come along and document the whole process.
And speaking of documentation, we're going to play an excerpt of the documentary that's currently being produced. Does it play? It did before. Oh, yes, it does. Yeah, it does. Oh.
But now you're muted.
One second, sorry about that.
We wanted to share with some.
This is 5.
Okay.
The whole thing and make some more.
How can I'll help on that matter this afternoon? Do you want me to do like silicone shapes?
That would be great.
Yes.
Or a clover leaf.
Can't you adjust it?
Yeah, I think so.
First time drawing with graphene oxide. Not too bad.
Wow, that's the biggest sheet of geo ever.
Yeah.
But wait, actually, is it?
No.
Okay.
It's like order that is finding itself as it's drying. So it's like through time, it self-organizes into these formations.
Good, good. C'est chaud.
C'est chaud.
C'est chaud.
Whoa.
It's so nice.
So everyone's happy. Big, but light, like easy to give the movement. Yeah. That'll be easier. Like imagine a spider's net.
Because people will have heard of graphene, graphite, but the whole thing is on graphene oxide.
Yeah,
which nobody has heard of, right?
Yeah.
How can we control the humidity, the temperature and such in the chamber
by giving like agency to the visitors.
To design the surface, that could also be interesting to have a variety of different parameters as paints. Am I losing people? I'm sorry.
The kind of field weed effect that can be pretty powerful visually.
We could get some of these, like 2 or 3 of these plants, and then I can micropropagate them.
This is for documentation purposes.
So neat. Everything is
Laser.
laser.
Nice. Can you amplify the motion?
It would unhook it and then it would just, yeah.
Something like that.
Perfect. Oh, so the crazy motion was really. It happened! Yeah. I think they are interesting to just to show them, like in the exhibition, just to show them. Like.
Yeah, exactly. We know exactly where these are coming from.
From Winter Jacket.
From Winter Jacket.
Just need to frame it correctly so that we can get a nice shot. I know for my personal practice, I like to have like really good micro shots of everything because it just looks beautiful. The tests that we're doing now are really exciting because they really move. It makes me sentimental and wants to see them flutter around on a surface and dance. They beg to be danced.
Like, look, ornamental banana. It doesn't show that plants grow better in graphene oxide, but it shows that plants can grow in graphene oxide, yes or no.
Yeah.
See, we don't need to test it in the lab. We could test it in the gallery.
Yeah. But I was just wondering that, I mean, in the meantime, I have to do some research.
Yeah.
Turn off the lights
Yeah.
from 10 in the night to 6 in the morning. So typically, since I don't know, like if you put it somewhere in the corner, like far away from the
But sometimes people work at night here.
Yeah. It'll look nicer.
Yeah, let's close the whole thing.
But is that gonna kill them?
Oh yeah, see? Yeah, you have small and big. So you have this one, which is
It's so light.
Oh, it's coming from volcanic rocks, so it's mostly silica.
Oh, the best part, the specimen exchange procedure.
out.
Noise on the image is like it's electrons popping.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the electrons scan the whole sample surface, and then ejected electrons are collected from the surface of sample and can be interpreted into the morphology of our sample. If we try to look into why something is beautiful, it kind of gives us some interesting scientific answers. But it's just that, okay, like we can't have them to look at one piece of graphene.
Totally.
That's my problem.
Yeah,
Just
totally,
like,
totally.
Don't laugh at me, it will look like an apple. Like a broom, little mini fringes. Oh, they're plant need water.
Like it definitely toasted.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But yeah, it doesn't burn anymore, so that's good. On va faire comme un herbier.
This one.
Sorry. Okay.
We were.
Yeah, we couldn't stop it.
Okay. Well, okay. So basically, different outcomes came out of this project, and it's not over. So
we are designing those prototypes. Oh, we're not sharing. Good. I taught on Zoom 3 years during the pandemic. 2 years. I think no. Hello? Yeah. Okay, that's good. So basically, different outcomes came out of this project. Group discussions, different mood boards. You've seen it in the video. Co-creation of different responsive surfaces out of graphene oxide that we are currently developing here within the context of this residency. New project ideas like how can graphene oxide foster the growth of plants. And I think it was a really enriching experience for both of us. You want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll speak for the part that I know, so the materials engineering students and postdocs. I could really see like this surprised me throughout this project, how they started talking to me about aesthetic aspects of their work and art, and they were really interested. And yesterday they had a panel here with other students from fine arts, and I thought the discussion was really deep at a level that I was not expecting from, like, that is not usually expected in terms of being able to reflect and to narrate on the experience from an engineering student. So I thought that that was a really interesting outcome of the project.
Yeah, and for us also, well, on top of what you just mentioned, new forms of protocols, new forms of documentation, new ways of engaging with materials is really enriching. That being said, just to end, a few challenges that we discovered along the way. Where do the material outcomes belong? Do they pertain to art? Do they pertain to science? Both at the same time? None of them. This is a question that we ask ourselves very often in the lab. Also, how to avoid instrumentalizing disciplines, how not to romanticize either discipline and keep our boundaries, but foster our expertise along the way. And also questions about publications.
Yeah, so clearly my students are spending a lot of time into this exhibition, but an exhibition is not something that's usually put on the CV of a scientist, right? They need publications. So we're trying to decide where can we publish this work, which is kind of in between the two worlds, right? So I feel like there are now a lot of funds and incentives for these kinds of collaborations, but then we still need to think about what to do with the outcomes so that they can be recognized by both communities.
And we're done. Thank you.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So a different project now, give more context to the discussion. So we're going to talk about a kind of, we don't even know what to call it. Gamey theater performance thingy thing that we did as part of a grant that Lynn Hughes, who's not here, and I got called Sustaining Liveness in Participatory Experiences, which was ventured as already an interdisciplinary meeting ground of game studies and design, immersive theater, dance, and other things around questions of liveness in sort of mediated society. But part of that is like making performance, doing design at the intersection of these spaces. Turns out that's easier said than done. So I'll introduce the design team and then you can do your, okay, so go back. So just so you know, so there's myself, who's a sociologist, and Lynn Hughes, who comes from studio arts, installation, sort of digital installation design, and all sorts of other things. Jody Allen beside me. You're going to say dance? Okay, coming from dance. Courtney and Scott from our PhD students in communication studies. And then there's like George Lopez Ramos, who is a postdoc, who is also a member of ZU UK Immersive Theatre Troupe in London, with whom we have collaboration. And then in addition, to make it even more complicated, another character, Jaakko Stenros, who is an expert on LARP, live action role-playing games from Finland. And somehow we wanted all this to come together. Good luck.
So I'm just going to try to describe briefly the thingamajig that we made together. Here you see, we actually ended up making two things, which was challenging. So you see the two posters for the two experiences, that two things that were one experience. There was a market that we curated specifically to play the game inside. So we made a participatory experience that was leveraged the mechanics of marketplaces. And just to make our lives more complicated, we made our own market as well. There were reasons for this, and it was a bit more, we had interesting objects, and it, you know, coming to this slide before, we were interested in being sort of experience designers and situation designers. So to do that, we also created the situation for the game to take place in, which was hopefully enhance the experience. So as a design paradigm, we were interested in exploring triads. We had a lot of threes within the game design. We had 3 teams of 3 participants and 3 roles in each team. The first role was the ears. We designed these handheld devices we called the seekers, and it was the most tech part of the experience. And there was locative audio embedded throughout the market that the ears role were able to trigger through these handheld. Contained in that is a Raspberry Pi, and we were using Bluetooth beacons around the space. So they could wander around and trigger stories, and the stories were about objects. And we were interested in, because of the marketplace, looking at value of objects and what gives value to objects, stories, history, any kind of thing. So the stories were from different perspectives about the objects and objectness, and sometimes first-person stories from objects, sort of just to give a creative atmosphere for the idea of stories about objects. The eyes would take photos of objects in the marketplace, and these photos were inspired by creative prompts at the end of each story. So the ears would hear a story, and at the end there would be a prompt. You know, take a picture of something purple. That was very bland, but they were more interesting than that. And then the eyes could interpret that how they wanted and interact with the space. And we were hoping that that would encourage a kind of deep looking and engagement with the objects in the marketplace, and also a different lens through which to see the environment. And then finally, the hands created objects. So it was important to us that we also had the artisanal aspect of creating and making. And so they would make an object that brought it all together. So the idea of the stories that they connected with, the photos that the eyes took, and then this central object. And then at the end of the game, the team together would tell the story of this collection. So it all became a collection together, and how the object tied together all of these elements. So as you can see, there's lots of different aspects to this, and that is sort of the interdisciplinariness. And this is sort of a photo of the storytelling and how everything came together. So as Bart said earlier, designing for interdisciplinary designing interdisciplinary projects is hard. And we really discussed for a very long time where the focus should be. So as you mentioned, we were in between the intersection of digital physical games and participatory theater and LARPing and dance coming. I kept trying to make it into a dance game. I don't know if I was at all successful, but I did get some ideas in there here and there.
Don't you remember the idea for the big dance number at the end? So it was one idea where everybody at the end, the teams would like all do this group dance number. So I'm just.
It almost happened. It was close. We had storytelling instead. But yeah, I think that was really an interesting part of the design process is like, you know, I described it to Bart earlier of like a Ouija board with like 3 areas, like moving towards a game. Is it a game? Is it a theater piece? Is it a dance piece? Is it a role playing, you know? And so really a lot of the design discussions were of like what percentage of each discipline was the sweet spot for us to design with and the end experience. And I think to people playing the game, for better or worse, I think had a challenging time describing it because it was really leveraging so many different types of experiences. You couldn't kind of put your finger on it. They're like, oh, this is interesting. I can't quite, you know, is it a game? Is it a treasure hunt? Is it a, you know, creative experiment? Do you want to say that?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the, I guess, morals of the story, so there's two kinds of interdisciplinarity going on here, and actually picks up on something Alice and Marta were talking about. So the object itself that we're making is this strange hybrid interdisciplinary object that we also don't know where to publish or where it belongs or what festival we can show it at and so on and so forth. It's complicated. And I don't know whether that is connected to the other problem, which is the design of the team and the process, which is also interdisciplinary. So Jody was starting to mention that. So we were really self-conscious, probably too much, about leaving the space open enough that all the different perspectives are influencing the design process, which, by the way, slows things down to at an incredible rate, so that you feel like half the time you're just going in circles. It's kind of ponderous. And Lynn and I were very conscious of like not forced leading the team into one direction or the other. And even when the two of us talk, it's like circles endlessly. But that ability, that's that Ouija board kind of sensibility that we just, and then when there's a moment of frustration, we got to do something. Let's just make a choice and go and see what happens. So a lot of that was going on. The market stuff was totally complicated by COVID, as you can imagine, because we couldn't go into actual marketplaces to do these things, which is how we ended up saying, well, hell, we'll just make our own market. We'll do it that way. So that iterative process, the interdisciplinary process, so that self-conscious design management is sort of like resisting our own training, but at the same time, being open to what would be called disciplinary perspectives. So for instance, a very obvious one is the triads thing comes from a kind of sociological preoccupation with the fact that sociology starts at 3, not at 2. So if you imagine most interactive experiences are between a person and a computer, or sort of they're dyadic experiences, whether it's 2 people or you and a machine or another object. But as soon as you add the third person or the third agent, as the case may be, you actually have a group, technically, in sociology. And it's like different properties of graphene. Suddenly, different properties appear, like social properties appear. And so when you start to design for 3s, you start to notice different kinds of interaction patterns, different kinds of problems, different kinds of contexts. So that's 100% disciplinary. I could have pushed it and we could have read, I could have made the team read like really esoteric 1950s sociology on this topic. But instead, no, we just drop it as a design constraint just to see where it goes. So whether we're pushing or pulling from communications or from dance and embodied experience or everywhere else, right? That isn't gone. So interdisciplinary doesn't erase that at all. It just changes the way in which these interact on this kind of, I love that idea, the Ouija board table. Any other morals of the story? Or are we good?
We're good.
We think we're good?
Yeah.
We can talk more in discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Christopher Dietzel. You can call me Chris. I use he, him pronouns. So the title of our presentation is Our Research Will Be Interdisciplinary or It Will Be Bullshit, Dating Apps, COVID, and the Intersections of Health, Community, and Intimacy. So for those of you who are familiar with feminist research, this title is actually alluding to an essay titled My Feminism Will Be Interdisciplinary or It Will Be Bullshit. And that was an essay written by Flavia Zodin in 2011 to call attention to the fact that feminism isn't just about white people. It isn't just white feminism. It has to take an intersectional approach in order to understand the diverse experiences of people who are touched by feminism. And so that was the inspiration for this title, is to call attention to the fact that when we're limited by one discipline, it limits us to see possibilities and understand the experiences of different people in different ways. And so taking an interdisciplinary approach allows us to be cognizant of those diversities. So as I mentioned, my name is Christopher Dietzel. Again, you can call me Chris, he, him. I'm a postdoctoral fellow working in the DIGS Lab with Stefanie, who's going to introduce herself in a moment. I have an interdisciplinary background, actually. So my studies started off in education, but actually when I did my undergraduate degree, I studied mathematics and French, which even that is quite going across disciplines. I did a postdoc in health studies and now I'm in communication. So I've been interdisciplinary by nature from the very beginning and taken an interdisciplinary approach to all the work that I do.
Yes, great, thanks. Yeah, I'm Stefanie, and I said to Chris, we should say something about ourselves because our backgrounds are interdisciplinary. And so, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology and sociology. My master's degree was called something obscure like social sciences of the internet, which combines sociology and communication studies, media studies, and political science and kind of a grab bag of things, and then a PhD in media and communication studies. And what we want to talk to you about today is one particular project, but as I've formed the Digital Intimacy, Gender and Sexuality Lab, the DIGS Lab, it really has become apparent that so many of our projects are strengthened by interdisciplinary lenses. So the project that we're going to talk about is one that we collaborated on with Dr. David Miles, who's at INRS, and I'll tell you a little bit about how it came together. So I don't want to cause anybody any emotional stress, but if you can imagine back to spring 2020, yes, maybe not in full detail, but spring 2020, Canada had just sort of started to implement its lockdown measures when the first wave of the pandemic hit. And so Chris and David and myself were, of course, locked down in our homes individually. And as scholars who study dating apps, we were also on our phones looking at this technology and noticing that apps that generally have this purpose of meeting other people, it's not like they stopped in the pandemic. They were still, you would open up your app and they were being responsive to the situation. And we got quite interested in this and we were like, wow, okay, so dating apps, what are they doing in response to the pandemic? So the three of us got on Zoom several times and we decided we would do a non-participant observation of 16 popular apps. And this included a diversity of apps, some apps more geared towards LGBTQ+ populations, and mainstream apps that tend to be more marketed towards heterosexual populations. And so we collected a massive amount of data, as you can see, over 2,000 app-related materials. So these were screenshots of in-app messages and notifications, blog posts, all of their sort of social media posts and updates and press releases, alongside news and media articles about dating and dating apps in the pandemic to provide some context. And so we went on to publish a sort of chapter that was an overview of our findings, and also an article that really focused on those apps that marketed towards heterosexual audiences. Perhaps it's not surprising to anyone that the route that they went was really this sort of discourse of, oh, the pandemic. Is it a perfect time for love? Well, we were actually surprised. Is it a perfect time for love? You have to do slow dating now. You can't just meet up. Why not take time, get on Zoom, have a coffee, order each other Uber Eats, and fall in love, right? So their discourse was very much about now find your soulmate in a slow, distanced manner. So we wrote about that. But today we want to share with you maybe kind of what we think are some of our fun findings from our focus more on the apps that are marketed towards queer populations, and the app Bumble, which markets itself as a feminist app. And so just to go a bit more into this case study. And so we want to talk about how these apps shaped communications and technological features in relation to health discourses, community discourses, and intimacy in the changes that they made in response to the pandemic.
And if I may add, just as Steph had alluded to on this slide, we actually published our findings in two different mediums. So the first one on the left was an edited book collection, or an edited book that was in health sciences. And then the one on the right is a journal article that was published in Social Media and Society. So as others on the panel have talked about, the work that we're presenting today is very interdisciplinary, and it was even shared in different audiences. So as Steph mentioned, we found three particular areas that were of interest to how people used dating apps during the pandemic, and how dating app companies presented these apps during the pandemic. And the first related to health. And we found that dating app companies were really emphasizing public health, mental health, and sexual health. And so on this screen and on further screens, you'll see that we have screenshots of the apps themselves. And with these screenshots, you'll see that they publicized public health guidelines and government restrictions. So dating apps were another medium through which the government and the apps themselves encouraged people to social distance, to stay at home, to wear masks, to pay attention of public health guidelines, to take precautions, etc. Another way in which dating apps encouraged health was, and particularly from a queer perspective, was mobilizing local queer communities to engage in community health. And so what this means is not only publicizing government guidelines that came from agencies or institutions, but also calling upon individuals to engage in public health initiatives. So for instance, Hornet, they have health ambassadors, which prior to the pandemic, we're really engaged in HIV work and STIs. So like encouraging people to do testing, to share their status, to talk openly about their status. But at this point during the pandemic, the app was encouraging those health ambassadors to talk about COVID and encourage other people to pay attention to those guidelines. And so you'll see in the second screenshot here, they also had notifications that popped up in order to encourage people to test for COVID, to encourage people that they were talking to test for COVID. And then with the third one, you can see the individuality that is encouraged here. Everybody can take a part. Another part of this was around mental health and sexual health, not just public health. And so the screenshots on here, you can see that apps encouraged people to pay attention to their well-being, to share resources with one another. And in a few instances, they actually had crowdsourced documents where people could upload and share information as well. So that's what Lex on the far left is referring to here. is that they had open source documents where people could add resources. And then there was also a big discourse around it's okay if you're not okay. And so you'll see that in both the second and the fourth slides or screenshots on this slide. Another thing that was quite interesting from a queer perspective is Grindr, which is the yellow screenshot in the middle. They actually often had an emphasis on casual sexual interactions. So one thing that they have said in their marketing is looking for right now. But as you can see in the second bullet point in that screenshot, they actually said right now can wait. So focus instead on your mental health and sexual health, even if it means putting off sexual interactions. The second theme that we really focused on was community. And from a queer perspective, it really encouraged solidarity around different identities, specifically in our analysis and for this presentation, looking at female identified individuals and queer people. And so one way in which queer solidarity and queer community was presented was around encouraging people to take care of one another. And that was not just from a health perspective, but in terms of queer solidarity. So what that means is like checking in and caring for other people with shared identities who might have similar problems as you. So recognize that we are all in this together, that we can come together and we can help one another, particularly where there is marginalization. Another way that we found community manifested through the apps was around activism. So at this point in the pandemic, there was a lot going on around rent campaigns. So controlling rent or pushing off rent so that people had the finances, if they weren't working, to be able to pay for their situations. There was also, especially towards the end of our 3-month period going into May and June, that was when there was a lot of movement around the Black Lives Matter. And so there was increasing stuff coming, not only in terms of paying attention to the pandemic, but being politically engaged in pandemic-related and other social movements. And lastly, in terms of community, this was really promoted through the app in terms of events and activities. So some, of course, was led by the community, but some was pushed by the dating app companies themselves. And you can see this here in terms of a variety of activities that were marketed towards queer publics. So that was online dating, it was online events, it was there were some dance parties that were happening. Different types of meetups and things that were virtually facilitated in order to encourage queer community. And the last theme refers to intimacy. And so we found that the dating app companies really pushed not just in-person connections, but virtual connections. And Steph spoke to that in terms of the second publication that we had at the beginning. And so one form of intimacy was intimacy between people. So thinking about how dating apps could still facilitate interactions, even if those were not in person. So they suggested ways that people could have virtual dates and engage in online interactions. And this was not just in a traditional sense, but particularly with a queer perspective, there was a lot more of an emphasis on sexuality. And so thinking about how people can engage in virtual sexual interactions. And then you can actually see quite interestingly with Lex on the far right, they were this app, and this is just one screenshot, but there were numerous times this actually came up, is that people were considering how they could give back to essential workers through nudes. Yes. So a form of solidarity, a form of intimacy in terms of supporting people who are on the front lines by engaging in sexuality, by sharing nudes with essential workers. And as I mentioned before, sexuality was a big theme, particularly among the queer and feminist apps, especially when compared to the heterosexual apps or for mainstream publics. These apps talked a lot more about how people can engage in digital sexual practices or individual sexual practices during the pandemic. So as you can see with this, there was a lot of emphasis on how people can engage in self-love, masturbation, sexting, sending nudes, as I mentioned before, how people can watch porn, engage in porn, and participate in virtual hookups.
Yeah, so this analysis really uncovered these findings around health and community and sexuality and intimacy, but they also uncovered sorts of tension and entanglement in the role of dating app companies kind of stepping into to do this work. And so as Chris highlighted, in contrast to the sort of mainstream apps, these queer apps repurposed existing health infrastructures. So they became part of the many forms of health communication during that very intensive part of the pandemic. They mobilized queer publics toward care, community, and political engagement, and they recognized and validated a range of intimate and sexual expressions. At the same time, these are proprietary apps, and so they have business strategies. And so there were discourses of neoliberal self-care mixed in with these sort of calls towards community. So there was kind of a dual messaging, right? Self-care can mean so many things. And sometimes in the messaging, the self-care was really that sort of light a candle, have a bubble bath, and take care of yourself. And so that's a more sort of individualized neoliberal kind of messaging around self-care that doesn't change any of the structures that may not be serving or helping people in crisis. The sort of discourse of community can be used to encourage app uptake, right, and be part of their brand sponsorships and product placement. So we saw, you know, sort of different products. Some of the sexuality workshops that the dating app Her was holding were also sponsored by Durex. So, you know, you see companies trying to get their products out even in relation to these initiatives, and a sort of power imbalance in the way that, you know, users don't have a lot of say over app design or how apps are governed or how their data is being used, right? And so if these, since these initiatives were, you know, looking to drum up participation on these apps, even though people couldn't meet in person, increased participation means giving more of your data. It means using the features that are provided to you, and there can be a power imbalance there, right? So yeah, I think those were our main findings. And we talk about this as a sort of example of an interdisciplinary project because working together, us plus David Miles, we brought together our different perspectives from media and communication and science and technology studies, Chris's background in health promotion and health studies, and among the three of us, knowledge of feminist and queer studies. This, you know, also allowed us, this project allowed us to harness opportunities for collaboration and creativity. It was one of the few things that got me through being locked down that year. You know, just checking in on Zoom and having this sort of new collaboration, a spontaneous team to work with. What did we mean by plurality of pandemic impact?
Oh, so yeah, what I, with that in mind, I wanted to call attention to the fact that with these dating apps and with how people were interacting with the dating apps is that we can see that the pandemic was having an impact on various aspects of people's interactions in society. So it had a health impact, it had a community impact, it had an impact on their intimacy. So even in terms of thinking of and we know this because we all lived it, is the pandemic didn't just impact one part of our lives, it impacted many parts of our lives. And so even with that, sure, there is value in focusing in on individual issues related to the pandemic, but because the pandemic, by nature of a pandemic, it impacts so many things, we found it very valuable to take an interdisciplinary approach to understand the ways in which they impacted people's experiences.
Absolutely. And yeah, and we were also able to combine our research perspectives and research methods, right? So I come from a sort of background of digital media and technology studies. And so we integrated a method that I've been part of developing, the walkthrough method, that looks really closely at app features. We combine that with a sort of discourse analysis of all the materials that we gathered from social media. And this was done in a very organized and forensic way that I think we can attribute to Chris's background in sort of more of a health field. And also David brought many perspectives from communication studies that I was less familiar with as well. So all of this comes together and is important, especially in the sort of subfield of dating app studies. I think people often brush off dating apps as sort of frivolous or maybe not something to be taken seriously, but many people are using dating apps these days. You know, I don't know if you have the latest statistics, but they've really become this sort of tool that overlays how people meet each other and forge connections. And in order to understand this sort of fairly new field, we need many different perspectives.
And to add on that, particularly since dating app studies is an emerging new field, and particularly where it relates to queer people's experiences, dating apps are a medium through which people, of course, connect and engage in intimacy, but it's also a space where people understand themselves and explore their identities. So there's additional meaning for queer people and dating apps. And as Steph mentioned, because this is a new field, there's many opportunities to take this field to grow and explore in new ways. But from an interdisciplinary perspective, actually kind of as you were talking about a minute ago, Jody, with the Ouija board, is that it can really be drawn in so many different ways that doing dating app studies actually mean the same thing to each person. We can go in a health direction. We can go in a media communication studies direction. We can go in a feminist or queer direction, but then are we actually talking about the same thing when we say that we're doing dating app studies? Is there a common thread to say that we're doing dating app studies other than the app itself? And so this then speaks to some of the challenges that occur in terms of doing interdisciplinary research. Is not only do we have to think about audience in terms of publishing, not only do we have to think about how we as a team to come together in terms of the concepts and the language that we're using. Do these words mean the same things? Are we talking about the same concepts? Are we applying them in the same ways? Of course, there are many opportunities for this, but then there are many challenges that we have to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, so we talk about the past in order to talk about the future. We are both embarking on new projects that have interdisciplinary aspects. And so for myself, I'm collaborating with some folks on a Sherrick Insight grant. The principal investigator is Diana Perry at the University of Waterloo. And this grant specifically, I'm collaborating with folks in leisure studies. Leisure studies looks at people's sort of everyday lives, but especially how they spend their free time. And a lot of people, you know, if you look at dating app research, a lot of people view dating apps as a form of entertainment. And they've really gamified meeting people. And so it makes sense that in leisure studies, people are interested in this. And so our new project, we're looking at dating apps in the broader Canadian context. We're looking at what are the potential harms that can be experienced through these apps, but then also how can these be mitigated and how can there be more equitable relationship building through dating apps.
And I'm starting a postdoc with Steph. And for my project, I'm particularly interested in understanding queer people's experiences with dating apps. And kind of along that same thread, I'm really interested in understanding the harms that people can experience in both online and offline contexts. So understanding how dating apps can be a mediator, facilitator to these experiences. And so I'm taking a three-pronged approach to try to understand those experiences among diverse queer people. So I'm going to be engaging in participatory action research with community organizations, going to develop and implement a survey, and also engage in qualitative work through interviews and focus groups. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was fantastic. I have a few follow-up questions, but I wanted to actually just pose one to all of you just to kind of get things going. And that is, I'm hearing over and over again this question about audiences, questions about new publics. And I know I'm privileged in the sense that I know a little bit about each of the kind of work, and I suspect you have different views on that. There are different notions of space, maybe something else we could maybe, if we have time, could get into. But this question of audiences, particularly when you're working in creative fields, like my background is also interdisciplinary, very interdisciplinary. But one of the questions that I ran into with multidisciplinary teams that working with, particularly trying to create responsive environments, and similar to, I think, some of the work that Alice, you and Marta were doing. But this question of like, who is the audience for it? Often when we're coming together and we're working, and we all have our different backgrounds, we're very interested in it. We're dealing with materials, you know, there's some pushback, and the rest is very exciting. And then, well, who do we tell about it? You know, we could find other people like us, but they aren't always clear where the publication venues stuff are, but also in the situational aspect, coming back to Bart and Jody, you know, when you're designing situations, who you're designing them for is very interesting about the constraint idea. But and in this case, you know, you're talking about audiences. They're part of your milieu in a sense. You know, you're experiencing it alongside them. You're using some of the same technology in the situation of something like COVID, and then. But where does this question of audience come up when you're doing that research, and how do you make those kinds of decisions to do the publications? I'll leave it there.
I'll start with some thoughts. I think one thing to add to this point of the audience is the point of time, because I think that during the project, things evolve, right? And so initially, at least for me, I mean, I think it was a common thing, but the idea was what we wrote in the proposal was that we would make some really innovative materials to begin with. And so in that sense, we really wanted to target different audiences, with one of them being the scientific audience. So we really wanted to have, and we still do, but that's where the time point comes in. So we really wanted to have some materials that would be new from a scientific perspective, and that we would be very proud of for the scientific community. And that has not truly happened yet, I would say. So right now, because there was this constraint of time, right? So we needed to bring something to the show. We ended up taking some side projects that would allow to prioritize another audience, which is a more general audience, right? So in the end, we still have all these threads kind of going. One that should go to the scientific audience, and that's like the PhD project of NEMA, right? So, okay, these things, we really want to make the whole graphene responsive and put some stuff inside the flakes that will make them responsive, and that nobody has ever done before. But at the same time, we needed something that could be shown and that we could work with together to begin with, because we wanted to have this co-creation project and going from one lab to the other. So that's when Ewan came up with the idea of, okay, let's put the graphene on a piece of plastic and let's have the combination to be responsive, which is not as novel from a scientific perspective as what we wanted to do, right? So I feel like I'm okay with the idea that there are different audiences that we want to target. And I think at least my goal is to have something that I'm proud of for different audiences, right? So something that, I mean, the plant experiment started completely for the expo audience, which is, in my view, the general public. We wanted to have something that would look pretty. And I thought, oh, let's put some plants, right? And then there's a lot of research actually into, can graphene be good for plants or not? So it became a scientific project, but born for the audience of the general public. It might go back to the scientific audience, right? Actually, the results were interesting beyond what I had initially thought. And it will probably become another project for NEMA for, you know, how to make this into a scientific product. So I feel like there are these different audiences that are that evolve at different times, and that's it. Yeah.
Thanks, Marta. I think it's really interesting what you mentioned. And it's also interesting to discuss the question of innovation in relation to audiences and publics, because you say, okay, well, we never had time to put all those ions in the graphene oxide. And I mean, this is true. We spent 2 years in between 2 labs and messing around and doing trial and errors and working with materials. So that's that was interesting, but from a design perspective, just working with humidity and heat is innovative, because it's not been done. So it's I hope, well, I mean, I like how the question of innovation modulates from one audience or one public to another, and also it's interesting in this project how certain, I would say, paths of research, like working with plants, were started from the, I would say, the exhibition perspective. So how do we engage a visitor with the materiality of graphene and the questions were very basic, but it was a sculptural question before becoming a scientific one. And now it's transforming toward like scientific innovation and working with tissue culture. But our question is really linked to time. We were like, okay, well, we need to show something. So what are we going to show? And so we wanted to do like strawberry tissue culture and tomato tissue culture a month ago. And we were like, well, it's never going to grow. Like we have this resonance in 1 month. What are we doing? So we started with this plant that I cut from my place, poor plant. And we were like, okay, is it going to grow in graphene oxide or not? So it was a basic yes or no question. And again, to us, having that kind of tangible result of seeing like, okay, roots can grow better within graphene oxide solution was really interesting for creating discussions with general publics. And when we say general publics, it's because here it's pretty diverse. We also had kids this week. So it was we needed a tangible way of engaging with that question. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just talk. I think there's maybe two audiences for something in like research creation is audience for the research and audience for the creation part. So I'll just speak to the audience for our experience was the participants. Like who are we marketing this to, and who do we want to come and try, and what kind of experience are they going to have? And that was really difficult to settle on a specific thing. And I think part of how we designed it to respond to that was having these very distinct 3 roles that did very different things, had different focus, but were really interrelated. So someone who is more inclined to being a little bit more solitary did the hands role, or making something with their hands, more tactile. Someone who is the more of a wanderer, wanted to engage with the space and walk around, would be interested in the eyes and the ears, maybe liked the object or any kind of reason. So we wanted people to be able to choose their interaction or choose how they would play the game, and then to support each of them within this triad structure. So there was a game loop between the 3 roles that they could support each other. So I think we talked a lot about that and how to be as open and inclusive as possible. It's the problem to designing for general public is you don't know who's going to come, and you want everyone to feel like there's something for them in the experience. So yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo that. One of the cool things about this project that we learned a lot from our practicing theater partners is that, you know, the show has to happen and the research doesn't stop when the thing is made. So we had to learn a lot about onboarding people, marketing, representation of our work just to like constitute an audience, which is really an interesting point about this interdisciplinary research. Connects actually with stuff that Alice and I are working on a different grant, right? That in a way, it's not a question of which audience, but about how do you constitute the audience for the work itself. So it's like you're literally creating an audience for the work rather than catering to this or that audience. And that adds this other dimension of super challenge, but super fun. The other thing I want to say, because I think the question of like where the outcomes go is a real structural, political, economic question for the people who want to do this work. I tend to take this like really weirdly privileged point of view and say like, there's your day job and then there's the stuff you do for fun. And it's important that the interdisciplinary space is fun, like passion fun, like, oh my God, fun, because the day job is really, really important. Like, you know, if you're a PhD student, you have things to do and you have places that you kind of have to publish if you're on a trajectory. Same thing for profs. So trying to create that space where the tension to like figure out where it's going to go comes down so that the fun can go up and you can get interactions like is happening in your documentation where you get these spontaneous interactions, which you never would have predict if you're always fretting about like what's this going, right? So the sort of conditions under which that is possible is important. You need money and you need time, and so part of it is about making money and making time in these spaces for that to happen. Then, and I'm curious about this question. It's a good question. So you do the work, you have fun, there's some kind of iterative outcome, and then there's this other stage, which I think we're really bad at, but is really important. And it's kind of like this retrograde thing, and say, okay, out of all the stuff we've done now, where can, and I like students to say, okay, from your own disciplinary points of view, what could you take here and run with it and do a little publication or a conference paper or something that goes on the CV that you can show to your department chair, and everything's like hunky-dory and good for you, right? So how do we do that? But that requires like another pass, like a kind of weird, okay, we did the fun thing, now we got to do the drudge work, I guess, or the day job stuff. Like, how do we go back over that? And often I'll do a ton of these projects all the time when I raise the money for them, and then I just there's nothing published at all. We just let it go. And that's privilege. That's severe privilege. Like, I don't need to, because I publish on my day job. So, but I think that's also wrong, right? So there is this past thing, I think, is a big question.
Do you want to say?
I might add on, but go for it.
So your question about audience made me think of an ongoing discussion that we had when we were doing this work around quite simply the term community. It doesn't invoke the same exact idea as audience, but nonetheless, that particular word was quite present in our research, because the dating app companies would often refer to, do something for your community, think about your community. And that word was, as David described, a polysemic term. So it means so many different things to so many different people without actually understanding what it without ever necessarily defining or centering a definition. And from a dating app perspective, from a company perspective, that's intentional, because then it can mean different things to different people without them having to define it. And certainly during the pandemic, are we considering a community in terms of who you're geographically bound to? Are we thinking about community in terms of identity and experience? Are we thinking about community in terms of the digital space that we occupy? There's a lot of interpretation that can happen there. And I think that then comes back to your question around who's our audience. Is when we're doing interdisciplinary research, it can mean so many different things to so many different people. And there's a lot of value in the openness of this term, of this idea. But then there's also, coming back to what we talked about in the presentation, is then what does that mean to where you're situating yourself? And I don't necessarily have an answer to that question. I do think it comes with both pros and cons. And that's part of the fun of doing this work, is that you don't necessarily have to limit yourself to one or the other. But it is a fantastic question. It's something that I enjoy exploring in this work.
For sure. Yeah, so just to sort of add a few different thoughts on that too. Obviously, there's the different academic disciplines that you're trying to speak to, and we talked a little bit about like the difficulty of translating across disciplines. And sometimes Chris would say, "Hey, I want to submit to this conference," and then David and I would say, "Well, it doesn't sound as fun as the media studies conferences, but go for it." And we can speak back to our own disciplines having come together as interdisciplinary scholars to unearth these findings. Beyond the academy, I think dating app studies, technology related studies, my hope is that our findings will reach users, will reach people who work with users, stakeholders around digital literacy. Like when it comes to dating apps, people might learn more about how to use dating apps from their relationship counselor, from sexual assault centers, from other supports, social services and supports that are out there. And then I'm also interested and hopeful, it doesn't always work, but that dating app companies themselves and their developers will take a look and notice that people are actually trying to evaluate what is the impact of the technologies that they create on societies. Frustratingly, one of the outlets for this is to try and have media coverage of your research. And I don't know, we could maybe talk for a while about the complexities of trying to get journalists and media outlets to cover interdisciplinary work in a way that really represents it. I know, on our project, it's maybe a lot more straightforward for a journalist to say, oh, well, you found that app companies are saying the pandemic is a perfect time for slow love and slow dating. And then that's all they latch onto, but they don't really look at your critique of it, or the much more nuanced argument that, almost everybody, so many people, even though we're in a pandemic, still have a sexual drive and sexual needs, and look at these other sort of less mainstream apps that and their users that are developing sort of practices that are COVID safe and still meet these sexual needs. That's a whole different journalistic article that might be less likely to get picked up. And so I think, this sort of question of how do we break out of the university with our research and have a broader impact can be challenging.
Okay, I have one more, and then I think we're doing pretty good on time. And I think we'll hand it over to the rest of our audience here for questions. I guess I'll come back to space because I think this is something I'd love to hear all of your comments on that as well. I was talking to Alice last night, and you shared with me that you're moving back and forth on a weekly basis between the labs. And it really struck me because one thing at Milieux, something we're very much have a big stake in, is the space. And not only the physical space, but the cultural space, the organizational experiments that we're trying to do. So I'd like to hear how space plays a role, not the literal physical space necessarily, but in terms of how it sustains or how it poses its own challenges for navigating doing interdisciplinary work between institutions, between labs. And also Bart and Jody, you're talking about literally designing a situation in a public space. Very different, I think, when what we were trying to do something at Milieux. So I'd love to hear kind of points of contrast with that and the kinds of challenges and how we might bring more public into the Milieux space and more of Milieux out into the public space. And then these questions of a community, I think is something that really comes back to, audience and community are not quite the same, space and community are not the same, but community, the space of community. I would like to hear maybe some of your comments and how that either sustains or helps or hinders interdisciplinary research.
Start?
Sure.
Okay.
Anyway.
No, I was voluntold. Well, yeah, space. I think especially when you have a material practice, I think it's really important. And it's interesting because when Marta and I met, we realized that we had very similar, practices in two different domains, similar interests, similar infrastructure, lab equipment. And there was already, I would say, affinities between the two labs. I mean, when I visited Marta's lab, I was like, oh, it's like us, but at McGill in the science side. And so that was really exciting because already you find common grounds through material engagement, through scientific instruments, through touching stuff and making stuff. Of course, there are different procedures, but that kind of back and forth between the two institutions, I think it was foundational to the success of the project, but where we're at now, at least, just because we all mentioned the question of time in terms of building interdisciplinarity. It takes a lot of time to get to know each other and to understand, okay, this is your background, this is where you're coming from, this is how you do things, this is how you think about materials, this is how you think about what is an exhibition. And we had many discussions about, okay, what's an exhibition, a residency, a workshop? What's the point of bringing scientific instruments in public space and so on? So I think lab infrastructure and infrastructure in general allows for that porosity in a very informal context where you're not all the time in a meeting, but you make stuff, you tinker, you mess around with materials and technology, and a little bit like in a critical making approach, the whole critical thinking emerged through making, but there's a material outcome. It's not just about talking about stuff. But so I think the lab space is extremely important, and I think Milieux also allows for that because we also, as the project evolved, we also infiltrated different Milieux spaces like Spec Life. We're growing plants in Spec Life at the moment. We're hosting the meetings in between Spec Life and the Milieux Biolab and McGill as well. And it's really interesting because for students, say from McGill, they can discover about the research that's being done at Milieux. And I think it's also interesting for engaging publics workshop. It's fundamental for us. And you mentioned like, the importance of space, and it made me think about painting in the 20th century, when in Europe, artist studios were very small, yield very small paintings, but in New York, they had huge loft, and we got what we got. So, I mean, space is crucial in terms of thinking with technology, materials, and space. Well, for the best of work or the worst.
I want to cut across because something you just said reminded me. So my training is in science studies, and my dissertation was doing ethnography in scientists' labs. One of the things I remember is how important the downtime is in a lab. A lot of waiting around, cleaning up. And that's when interactions happen. So, often as an ethnographer, I'm watching people working in the lab. When there's actually signal, there's nothing to see for sociologists. But when there isn't in these spaces, that's where the weird stuff happens. I wonder if that is something similar, right? So this sort of sense in which being together, doing something, not just having a meeting, creates space in space.
Yeah, social space.
Yeah, really, that's for sure. I agree. I just wanted to add two small things. Actually, one kind of funny thing at the beginning when I visited Alice's lab, like she said, oh, it actually looks pretty similar to our lab. I was really surprised, and in fact, I noticed. So in my lab, there is a chemical fume hood, and in her lab, there is a bio hood, so where you can grow stuff. And because, like you saw, I also grow cells, and we don't have a bio hood. I'm like, maybe we could start using Alice's bio hood also for my scientific project. But actually, another interesting kind of little thing about this is that, so because my lab is a chemistry lab, and at McGill, there are a lot of safety procedures, to be able to work in a lab. That created some problems at the beginning, right? Like we had to do all sorts of documents so that her students could be officially visitors at McGill, so that they would be covered by McGill insurance if anything happened, right? So that's kind of an interesting challenge that your question made me think about. But I mean, overall, I completely agree with what was just said, so that it's because we were in these spaces together and we were looking at the things moving or not moving together that the ideas came up, right? So, yeah.
I think Bart mentioned, I mean, as we all been talking about the pandemic, is we started designing this during the pandemic or just before, and then we're forced online. And so we're designing a local participatory game experience for people where we want people to be physically together, and we're doing this over Zoom or over Discord for like a year and a half. And so
study dating apps.
Yeah, we should. It's true. So yeah, we should have. But it was starting to shift our end result. We were like, well, actually, maybe it's a board game now, or maybe it's a this, or maybe it's a that. And we kept, the final shape of it kept sort of shifting by what was possible in the spaces we were inhabiting at that moment. And then as things were opening up, yes, we were going from this online space and trying to find ways to play test online. So there was, online board gaming things we could sort of like make it into this and see what the mechanics were. And then we moved to Milieux and we're testing trying to imagine public space in sort of the top floor, like how can we still test things within not public space for public space. And then we sort of did an in-between and made our own safe, or not safe, but like public space is always unpredictable, but our market, we made the market. And now our next thing, we're going to go and do it in London in a pre-existing market that we aren't making, which I think is Bart's ideal from the beginning.
That's where we started, right? We thought that's what we would do. But I'll just underscore this other point that Alice and Marta started with, that I think even pertains as we cross into social sciences and humanities work. So for sure, interdisciplinary research creation needs a doing and not just a talking. Because we found even on Zoom, even when we were just in meetings talking, it wasn't the same as when we were actually doing, like setting up stuff, trying to get the tech working, doing site tours and all that kind of stuff. That's where a lot of our ideas came from in terms of the interdisciplinary collaboration. So that common doing, that's sort of like take a group of people who are very different and make them do something in common. They can talk to each other, it's fine, but something else happens. Maybe it's a little bit magical. I don't know, it needs to be studied. Something else happens in the doing. And since I've learned that, would even apply that to my sociology students. So I say, like, fine, sociology students don't need to make stuff normally. They collect data and they talk about it and they write about it or whatever. But now I've since got them to start doing stuff, doing things, making things. They don't have to. It's not related to their research, but I don't know. There's something about that act, the notion of problem solving with, I don't know, hands. It's material. Some kind of material practice seems to bring something to the idea of interdisciplinary collaboration that I think is real, no matter what the discipline or whatever the director.
The question of space is really interesting, especially when studying dating apps, is because this is something that people connect with using their phones. So a dating app is, of course, a digital space. However, the types of interactions that many people seek through dating apps, of course, are physical interactions. So there's already how this field operates and thinks and interacts, how we study dating apps, is there's really this question of space is constantly being explored in terms of what happens online as well as offline, and not just online or offline, but so not thinking about these as distinctly different spaces, but as a continuum through which people can interact. So I think, and bringing that into the context of the pandemic, that question of space was part of our interest in doing this research in the first place, is because of the premise where people connect online but meet in person. That entire premise was complicated, prohibited because of the pandemic. People were still encouraged to meet online, but were not allowed to meet in person. And so that's really where our question came from, is then how do the dating app companies, as being ones who are responsible for curating the space, for presenting the space, for promising the opportunities associated with this space, how then are they responding to then these new restrictions, given that the offline part of that experience was prohibited. So yeah, the question of space is really integral to this field, to our work. And it was a big motivator in terms of doing this research in the first place.
Yeah, and just to speak to the research side, the funny part about digital research is it's not really visible. Sometimes Bart and Harry, they tell me, people are coming through for a tour. They want to see the labs. Okay, print some screenshots, everyone, let's make something visible. So it can be hard sometimes to really give a material side to the research, or to, demonstrate visually that research is happening. But the actual research space, and having the space at Milieux to come together and collaborate, especially since the pandemic, and being back in person and having those conversations. And it really is in that sort of downtime, the in-betweens, that, as you say, the magic happens, right? You start to have spontaneous conversations, and you realize that, okay, what you've been looking at on the screen, or what you've been looking at in the app from your researcher perspective, is similar or different to what someone else in the lab has been looking at. And then, that comes together as a new idea. So I think space is really valuable in that sense.
Thank you. I think with that, we'll, if we have a microphone, maybe we could take some questions from the audience. Or I have lots more, but.
Hi. Oh, hi. Well, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have a question for Marta and Alice, correct? So you showed us some documentary that was made by one of the students in your lab, Alice, right? Yeah. Well, I found I found it super good, and I was just thinking, because we talk a lot about outreach when we do science, and usually when we do outreach, we go more for like activities where you just like explain in very big detail how we do science, going back to the basics. And I don't know what you think about those types of initiatives, instead of going for an approach of just like over explanation of what's going on, just having more like an art approach of like showing how beautiful science is. And I don't know, I never thought about that, but I think it would actually be such a cool tool to make it more accessible, but in another way. What do you think?
About the video, but when we thought about the Audace project, I remember we had conversation about like how to engage with public, because we wanted to engage in a way, but we didn't know how. This was really bottom up as a project. And something we wanted to avoid, I remember, was about like communicating science. And because we realized that what we were doing was co-experimenting between one another and one lab to the other lab. So when we started working with Jacob, who's a Concordia alumni in film production, I don't know if Jacob, oh yeah, he's there. Hello, Jacob. So when we started working with Jacob, it was really important for us to have a research creation approach to the documentation of the lab work. And it's not just about saying, oh, well, this is graphene. Look at that. It's one atom after another atom. So it's not about explanation. It's more about documenting the process. And Jacob came with very interesting ideas about cinema direct cinema. So he really shadowed us like it was a reality TV show. At one point, we were like, oh, okay, I need to go to the restroom and escape from Jacob because he's always filming me. So, but it was really interesting because it captures like what's really happening in the lab, and it, like without filter. And it at one point is this is what happened. We did it a little bit, some bad jokes, but we cut it out. But for us, it was also very important to get not to impose some kind of format on this documentary film, but really to let Jacob have input on the outcome, and also make it a research creation piece in itself and not just an explanation of science. No.
I'll just add one thing. I think, yeah, you're right, Capucine. I think actually, I think the documentary is one of the most beautiful things. I mean, they're all kind of nice, but that's really an artwork, I think, of what Jacob has done. And I think that's why we put it in the presentation, because it just explains what happened through those images and sounds and little voiceovers. So you don't have to say much else. You just watch the video and you understand you kind of understand, right? So I agree. I mean, it was really a way to let people understand what this project was. Yeah.
So I found that documentation interesting, really interesting, and I wish we had, yeah. Anyway, but I'm worried about romanticizing this collaboration, right? So excellent, Jacob. It's really good, but very romantic, in my opinion. And I wonder and there's importance to that. This is going back to what I was saying about paper interdisciplinary versus practical interdisciplinary. We have to make it look exciting and productive in order to keep funding, to create more spaces. Milieu needs it. We can't stop doing that. We have to be able to do that. But we're maybe obfuscating the larger sort of socio-structural political conditions under which these happen or don't happen. So I don't know, there's a tension there, right?
Interesting, because well, you haven't seen the whole movie, and it ends badly. Yeah, the end people cry, we scream at each other. No. It doesn't happen. No, but that's really interesting because it's not, but we also, when we think about all the funding structures, say ODAS, NFRF, and all these big interdisciplinary structure, it's really interesting, and it's meant, high impact, high risk, possibility of failure. But yeah, right, if you write in your grant that I'm gonna fail, you get the grant. Like you can't. Like it's not. There's a kind of a gap between the discourse and what you have to produce and what you have to deliver, and how you pretend you will do things and how it happens in reality. And I find those tensions extremely interesting to look at the systemic difference between the funding structures, what's happening in reality, and then how you talk about it in different publications. And I think that, not to avoid your question about tensions and romanticism, but like we haven't had like big problems that I was thinking. I was like, where were the problems? Like, so I was like, okay. And of course, I'm totally aware, and by experience also, that not all collaboration work this way. This one was pretty smooth. Yeah.
I don't know. I think maybe what is not represented in the movie is the fact that we have not reached what we, like I said in one of the answers before, right? We have not reached what we had set out for, right? We have not reached this innovative scientific membrane that moves on its own. You know, that's what we wanted to do at the beginning. The movie certainly doesn't tell you that. But because the goal of the movie was to show the co-creation process, I think in that sense it does a good job at it, because it was a pleasant experience. I mean, clearly there are, he clearly chose he interviewed us in a few occasions, and he clearly selected the parts that were more poetic, but yeah, I don't know what to say. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm just interested in which way you find it to be romanticized, because coming from a science background, usually what we do when we want to promote our work, it shows how good it works and like sparkles, like, look, we're going to change the world. And for me, this documentary was actually super different in terms of what we normally show as of scientific results. And that is why I was thinking, it's a different way to reach people. So how do you find it romanticized?
Yeah, I'll just expand, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with what's going on. And you can bet, as a director of an institute who has to do this, I'm going to use every inch of that documentation I can. The romance is the let's all get along and do amazing things together romance. Yeah, it's beautiful. It is idyllic. And I love the story of like projects that get along and that really, pitch these things that maybe shouldn't be together, but turns out it's really cool. Like, who's not going to love that story? And it's and it's big right now. The science thing is a big deal. So you're tapping into a really nice public discourse with this story, and it needs to be told. The larger thing is kind of maybe the sociologist and science in me, which is thinking about the institutional contexts, these lab structures inside of chemistry at McGill, inside of the story of the biolab and what it took, right, to build that thing, to maintain that thing at Concordia. Holy shit, that's like a whole thing, right? So
the roadblocks are,
it's not just roadblocks, but the context. The particular kind of institutional, political, we can do political academic context. Audace has a role to play in this. Is really weird if we want to tell that story. I mean, how do you do that in a documentary? I do not know. Yeah.
So do you see this as an art piece, or do you see this as a documentary that should represent the truth of what's going on in the field?
And I think that, okay, I now understand Bart's point of view better, in the sense that I think the goal of this video was really to show the co-creation process and how artists and scientists can work together in the lab. That was the goal, the limits of that video. And but then I understand that it would also be interesting to scratch the surface in terms of institutions, funding, lab structure. How do you put a bio fume hood up there? How much time it takes? These stories are interesting in the making of arts and science and practices. I'm not saying that it should go in the same movie, but maybe there should be another movie about this.
I mean, I think it was also it was mainly an art piece, right? Like, I mean, Jacob is there. Maybe he should answer some of the questions with his camera.
Sorry? Oh, okay. What was the question?
Is the movie romanticizing what was done? What was your goal in making? What was your personal goal in making the movie?
If I could have brought more cynicism into it, I would have, but it just didn't happen. Like it was pretty smooth. In terms of whether or not it's an art piece. If the documentary is an art piece, then your research is performance art.
Mm-hmm. Well,
yes.
I mean, the research is not performance art, right? But the fact that you filmed it and then you edited it, that part to me was the art piece.
Okay. I guess the trouble is I sort of try to do like a non-obtrusive editing. Like I didn't want to structure it in a way that made like a specific argument or something. So.
But it does. I mean,
accidental art. Perfect. Yeah.
So I have a question, like more general. When we talk about a paper or publication out of this interdisciplinary research, some of them like they use a approach and then they solve a puzzle and give a general discussion and also like a result of some questions they want to ask. And some like for us, what we do, it's more like we experiment on how to combine scientific knowledge together with art side of work. So in that way, we want to like probably to present a case study that how these things can work together. So that make me want to ask a general question, basically. So how do we evaluate the outcome of this interdisciplinary research? So is there any like advice that you can provide us?
Thanks, Yuen. That's a really good question. And I think that's a question that Marta and I have been asking since a few weeks, months. And I think that, I don't know how you feel, fellow research creators, but I think that in research creation, we are also privileged because we kind of have more currencies, like a workshop is a form of dissemination that's valid, an exhibition is valid, an article is valid. And if, say, we publish in advanced materials, that's valid for me. If we publish in Revue Espace Art Contemporain, it means nothing for you. So there is a kind of imbalance in that, where we're kind of catch-all for every form of dissemination, and it works, and we're lucky in a way. But it demands, I think, thinking about like what can be what can we take from that and how it can be useful for your discipline also.
But I think her question was even more deep than that, right? Because she asked, how do you evaluate the result, right? So not just where do you find the publication purpose, that it like
saying that in terms of validity of the result, if we host a workshop, it's a valid, it's in terms of peers evaluation and how it's considered a valid form of dissemination. Yeah.
I think what I would be interested in hearing from you and from the others is like, so how, you know, I can tell you, okay, I'll tell you my answer from a scientific perspective. I mean, how do I evaluate it? I think we grew through this, right? And I think there were some pretty cool things that we learned also from a scientific perspective. I don't think it's, I mean, I don't think it should be the end, because I don't think we, like I said, I don't think we achieved. Is it something that, like, at some point I tried to, because I'm also an artist, I'm a watercolor painter, and I was talking to my watercolor painter teacher and friend about this exposition, and he's like, oh, it's really cool. So you're gonna try to do something that you can be proud of as a scientist and Alice can be proud of as a designer. And I thought that's, I mean, that's, that probably should be the goal, but is this like that? Is it something that I'm proud of as a scientist? No, I mean, I love it and we made it work. There were a lot of technical challenges to make this thing work, but is it top-notch science? No, it's not, right? So that's why, that's what I'm saying. Like, from a scientific evaluation perspective, it would not meet the standard that my friend kind of put, right? I am not super proud of that object as a scientific innovation, but I am very happy with the process that led to that object. And I think that there's potential, you know, to go from that, which is what we were able to achieve in 1.5 years, right, to something that I will be proud of as a scientist. And so that's what I'm curious, like, is that something that you're proud of as a designer, right?
But I think that in design, the question of innovation is like, okay, what can you do with this material and what kind of application you can bring it in terms of architecture, installation. So yes, it's useful for us because it's never been used in design or architecture. So the question, you know, it's the step is, I don't want to say lower because it's just different. And after that, how do you, what kind of form do you give to this thing? Because I look at that and in terms of form, as a designer, I also find it limited. It's not, you know, it's not what I call an achieved piece of work. It's a prototype. But again, it comes back to the question of time. It's like, what can you do in 1.5 years working with a new material, with 7 new people working together, and you need to start somewhere. So I don't see this as the end, but and I don't see the form of this interesting as a designer. I see the material capacity of it very interesting as a designer. So that I guess the criteria for evaluation of the work are different. Yeah.
So epistemologically, whether it's science or it's art, I'm going to argue that the criteria for evaluation is the same. Take the state of the world at time A, do something, and see what's happening at time B, measure the difference. Whether I make art or whether I make science is the same. We just have different ways of doing those measurements and validating them. So in principle, it's a cultural problem. So there's a cultural relevance problem in terms of how one expresses the measurement of that difference in these different contexts. The fun, and I mean, look, historically, it's been fun in the sciences. Lots of incredible things have happened in the sciences through interdisciplinary mergers where people thought what was there was crap from the perspective of any given discipline at the time. And then you birth whole new disciplines with journals and programs and departments. The sciences do interdisciplinary without thinking about it because they kind of have no choice. In social sciences and humanities, we hang on to our disciplines much more tightly historically, but it's really the same thing, right? What's really cool in research creation is that measurement if we just do publications. It's kind of weird. And when I work with engineers, I always find it weird because engineers can stop a type at the point they do a publication. We cannot. We have to actually have it in public. And especially for me, who's like in games, the game won't even work if there isn't somebody to play it. So, the game doesn't exist until that work is in some public, in some kind of, so that we can't do anything at the level of publication. The measurement will make no sense. It's completely invalid. It's just hypothetical ideas, speculative design, we call it, right? So now we move to this other space, but now we have a whole other thing. And, you end up with a whole new measurement problem. Oh, you're going to do interviews with people and see like how many people here liked that performance or love that piece of art. And we're going to call that like measurement? No, not that either. So there's a whole other kind of discussions that then appears, but it's different. I just don't think it's different.
I feel like this conversation is revealing how many academics are also perfectionists. But I think one of the words that happened in the conversation over here was potential. And I think what we showed about sort of engaging in this project that then has led us to the projects that we're now going to embark on into the future. Chris and I are working towards this postdoc, and then on this other project about Canadian dating app users that, sprung forth from the potential created through our interdisciplinary collaboration in part. So I don't know, I think part of it is the ability to go on and continue from there toward those standards that you're talking about.
Like from what I learned from this valuable discussion, I think the outcome, the difficulty is how to condense all this outcome in the scale. Actually, like I said, it's a time, it's gonna probably like aging and then condense, and then probably it will change into something big or small, like a personal, or for example, for kids, who knows, in 10 years, he or she will reflect on what they saw on the exhibition about graphene oxide, right? It will become something, but not necessarily have to be condensed in in 1 month and written in an article, and then we see that's it. That's the end. That's what I learned, and I think personally it broadened my horizon as a scientific researcher, and that's something outcome. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else in this space have a question? Or online, if you have any questions, you can always turn on your camera and unmute or use the chat function.
Okay, well, I think maybe we'll end it there. Yeah, we're right at on time. So this has really been fantastic. Thank you very much, all of you.
Okay, thank you to everyone for coming into this space and to Fourth Space today for helping this, activating this conversation. On a big thank you to the audience for the questions also. And it was just great to hear all those different perspectives. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now for everyone online. Just a quick reminder, of course, is already available online, so you can, share, go home and watch again. But please join us again later today for the final part of the Milieu, the Commons residency and exposition. If you don't like the game, change the rules, which is a launch of an alternative modes of video game production white paper with Michael Iantorno and Marie LeBlanc Flanagan. That's this afternoon at 4 o'clock. The other thing you need to do is have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.